Hey everyone, Cool Kid here. This video is going to be a sequel to a previous video of mine, titled DE Doesn't Understand Overguard, that I released about a year ago. I do recommend you watch that video before this one, but if you don't want to, I'll give you the SparkNotes version of it here in a second. I also want to clarify that I don't think I can make the game better than its developers. This is just my opinion based on what I've experienced and observed as a fairly long-time player of the game. Because the original video came out so long ago, lots has changed when it comes to Overguard and the state of crowd control in general, so I wanted to make this video to check in and see how things have evolved since then. Real quick, let's recap what the original video talked about, both for the new people and as a refresher. So, when DE released the Eximus rework with Angels of the Zariman, they introduced a mechanic called Overguard to make those new special enemies more threatening. The idea, in its original incarnation at least, was to make it a special overhealth bar that prevented players from crowd-controlling special units so that they would have to contend with their unique mechanics. At first, this was limited to the aforementioned Eximus units, as well as the new Thrax and Kuva Tricarian enemies, and the Nox, all of which either had special abilities, or in the case of the Nox specifically, a direct counter to their Overguard. Ancient healers could also give it to nearby enemies, but so sparsely that it hardly mattered. The last video went in-depth about how the scope of Overguard has broadened over time, being expanded to more and more enemies and being more prevalent than ever before. EDA and the introduction of bolstered belligerence was the main thing that drove me to make that video, being a modifier that grants all units in a mission Overguard and feeling like the complete antithesis of what the mechanic was originally meant to do. The reason this is all important is because Overguard's prevalence makes crowd control focused playstyles less and less useful, which is slowly but steadily killing off a once rich and interesting approach to combat. Combine that with a lot of mission types punishing the use of crowd control, like defense for example, and it just led to CC feeling bad to use in a lot of the game. If you want my in-depth coverage of the problem, its history, how it's affected the game, and how I thought we should fix it, you can go watch the original video. For our purposes though, that should be all you need to know. So, that original video came out right after the release of Dante Unbound in March of 2024. Since then, we've had 3 major updates that have all made significant changes to the game, but first, I actually want to touch on something I should have addressed in the original video. During the segment where I talk about how long it had been since our last CC-focused Warframe, I failed to mention that Hydroid and Inaros maintained their CC emphasis post-rework. They aren't new frames, so I wouldn't have counted them anyways, but it does show that DE wasn't pushing the playstyle out of the game on a kit level. It also makes Pablo's hesitancy to rework Loki even more confusing, but that's besides the point. So, after Dante Unbound, we got Jade Shadows in June, which made a lot of significant changes that directly affected this topic. And, you know, the childbirth QuickTime event. The first and most obvious was the addition of a new Eximus unit, the Jade Light Eximus. This Eximus unit targets players with a tracking laser that deals escalating heat damage the longer it's on them. They can target up to 2 players at once, and their beam can be destroyed by shooting the orb that spawns it. A lot of people acted like this enemy being added bolstered my argument or that it would be something I would hate, but I feel like that was kinda missing the point. The Jade Light Eximus is a neat enough enemy, and while I do wish it was easier to tell where the Eximus was relative to their beam attack, I don't have any major qualms with them. They didn't increase the prevalence of Overguard or anything like that, it just gave us more Eximus variety, which I'm personally fine with. Operation Belly of the Beast did spam the ever-loving hell out of this Eximus unit, which made CC pretty much a no-go, and that did suck. But because it was a limited time event, I don't find it to be indicative of some kind of fundamental problem in the approach to the mechanic. Beyond the new Eximus type, we received 2 direct counters to Overguard. The first was a rework to the magnetic status effect, which was expanded to apply its damage increase to both shields and Overguard, starting at 100% more damage at 1 stack, and going up to 325% more damage at 10 stacks. On top of that, enemies who have their shields or Overguard broken while a magnetic proc is active will emit a radial electric proc, with said proc's damage scaling based on the amount of shields or Overguard destroyed and the number of magnetic procs on the enemy. This was a really great change that made magnetic a much more appealing option for Overguard heavy environments and also made it a top tier progenitor element. The radial electric proc is especially cool because it instantly CCs the enemy as soon as their Overguard breaks, rewarding players who actively seek out Eximus units by shutting them down as soon as their defensive layer is destroyed. Now, while the magnetic changes are great, the second major counter is the real star of the show, Secondary Fortifier. This secondary arcane causes your pistol to deal 8 times more damage to Overguard, and on top of that, you'll also grant yourself 1 Overguard for every 100 points of Overguard you remove from enemies, up to a cap of 15,000 Overguard. While this arcane does have its limitations, namely that it only works on your pistol, it fundamentally changes the player's relationship with Overguard as a mechanic. Now when you see an overguarded enemy, you can not only strip that defense super fast, but you're also giving it to yourself, which allows you to essentially flip the script and make you immune to the Eximus unit's bullshit. I mean, think about it. The vast majority of Eximus abilities don't really do anything against Overguard because it makes you status immune and grants you a gating window. Energy Leeches can't magnetic proc you, Arson Eximus can't light you on fire or knock you down, Blitz Blasts won't knock down and will have their damage eaten by the Overgate, Venomous Eximus can't get under your Overguard to reach your health, Jade Light Eximus can't trigger their heat proc, which massively reduces their damage, and Shock Eximus units already didn't really do anything. There are a few exceptions to this though. Leech Eximus units can't drain your health, but they will still heal themselves and allies by taking your Overguard. Arctic Eximus units also aren't affected by player Overguard at all, both because their bubble is a purely defensive ability, and because for some reason their slow aura still works through Overguard. These slow auras also stack, which is super annoying, but we'll touch on that later. In a funny way, Secondary Fortifier lets you become the Eximus, shutting down their crowd control by giving the Overguard to you. The last thing I want to mention is the addition of the Ascension game mode, which is split up into 3 phases: Defense, Elevator, and Escort. All 3 of these phases benefit greatly from CC, and while damage is still incredibly valuable, especially for getting batteries in the Elevator phase, CC is a remarkably relevant and useful option here. I'm very glad to see how CC-friendly this mode is. It very much feels like they designed the game mode with those types of abilities in mind, which is fantastic. So, overall, Jade Shadows gave us a new Eximus type, but also a lot of powerful options to deal with Overguard, and a game mode that lets CC shine. This was a great update for crowd control, though a lot of the counters to Overguard are still reliant on damage. Even so, you can synergize putting Fortifier or Magnetic on your loadouts with CC frames to help them get their kit working more effectively. This is more of a minor footnote, but during the Lotus Eater's era of hotfixes, Netra cells were changed so that only the player had to be standing in the ring to make progress when getting kills. Previously, enemies had to be in the ring to count towards the progress bar, but now so long as the player that killed them is in the ring, it'll track. This makes Netra cells much more CC friendly, and while it still doesn't really make the game mode as pro-CC as something like Interception, it does make CC abilities much less of a self-sabotage button. So, now let's move on to Koumei and the 5 Fates, which was released in October. This update also contained a lot of important additions that helped expand crowd control's effectiveness. The first thing I want to highlight is actually the Nova rework, which brought with it a small but important change. Previously, damage vulnerability abilities varied a lot when it came to what health types they actually affected. Some worked on Overguard health and shields, some only health and shields, and some only health. With Nova's rework, this was standardized to allow all damage vulnerability effects to increase damage to Overguard, which was a big change for the frames it affected. I'll go ahead and show on screen now what abilities were granted this buff. So beyond that, we have one of the biggest pieces of the update, Companions 2.0 Part 2. This did so much for the game that I can't hope to cover all of it here, but the important thing for our purposes is the addition of Beast Claws. These were a new weapon type that allowed Beast Companions to have moddable weapons. To be more specific, this affected Kubros, Kavats, Predacites, Vulpaphylas, and the Helminth Charger. In addition to moving a lot of damage mods to these claws and away from the companion itself, we were also introduced to posture mods, which are essentially stance mods that modify the companion's behavior. For this video, the most noteworthy of these is Assassin Posture, which causes your companion to target Eximus units and deal 300% more damage against Overguard. This lets your dog or cat or what have you autonomously destroy Overguard, which helps your crowd control abilities be more effective with little effort. Throw this on with something like Duplex Bond, and you can have a whole posse of the little critters running around and cracking open Eximus units like tuna cans. Even beyond Assassin Posture, the Sunika Kubro also received a major overhaul to its unique precepts, one of those being Unleashed. This precept was changed to also make the Sunika focus on Eximus units and deal a further 300% damage to Overguard. If you were to combine Unleashed with Assassin Posture and maybe even Duplex Bond, you'll find that this dog is capable of blowing up Overguard incredibly quickly, making it the de facto anti-Eximus companion. This is something that was technically added in Jade Shadows, but while we're on the topic of companions, I think it's also worth noting that Magnetic could now be put on primer weapons to help make Overguard weaker too. With Tazakor being reworked into a fantastic primer weapon with Koumei's update, on top of already strong options like Verglis and various robot abilities with Manifold Bond, and the avenue of companions softening or even breaking Overguard was made stronger than ever. A big point in the last video about this topic was how it felt like we weren't ever getting any CC-focused Warframes, and shockingly, this update bucked that trend with the release of the titular Koumei. While much of her strength comes from her decrees, her 1 and 4 are both very CC-focused abilities, which was really awesome to see. I know people have very mixed opinions on Koumei, and this video isn't about her. I just want to highlight that the release of these CC-focused tools in her kit was really refreshing after all of the kill enemies in a line frames we had been getting. Except for Jade, of course. She was kill enemies in a circle. The new mission type brought with this update, Shrine Defense, is another node that is remarkably CC-friendly. Essentially, you have to prevent Infested from entering these circles so that offerings can be generated, and once you bring 5 to the Koumei statue, then you fight a boss. CC is very valuable for keeping enemies out of these rings, much like Interception, though the boss itself still requires quite a bit of damage. Even so, most pressure for damage emerges on the steel path, and even in that environment, crowd control is a great tool for keeping enemies from slowing down the mission. So, to recap, Koumei's update gave us a big buff to several damage vulnerability abilities, made companions much better at seeking out Eximus units and killing Overguard, gave us our first CC-focused frame in ages, and gave us a very CC-friendly mode. Now, at this point, I know what you're probably thinking. Cool kid, what the fuck? The title of this video says that DE still doesn't understand Overguard, and yet this entire time you've been going over changes they've been making that have been actively addressing the issue. This is true, and honestly, if I'd made this video right after Koumei, I would have named it DE Does Understand Overguard. But we have one more update to get through, the update where it all went wrong. Warframe 1999. To start, I want to talk about the positive changes this update made in regards to crowd control. Most obviously, Nyx was reworked, keeping her strong CC identity while modernizing her kit for the current state of Warframe. Her Psychic Bolts can now also steal Overguard and grant it to her, but they steal very little Overguard, so it isn't really that strong as a direct counter to it. Instead, it's more of a vessel for granting Nyx Overguard instead of a way to easily destroy or remove it. New magnetic mods were also added, which makes taking advantage of the magnetic status buff much easier and more accessible, which was a phenomenal addition. The new game mode, Legasite Harvest, is what I'll call a CC-neutral game mode. Crowd control can help keep enemies away from Kalimos, which is really valuable, as that means they can't contest her and slow down the progress of the mission. Thing is, killing enemies also accomplishes this, and has a chance to spawn pickups that can be brought to Kalimos to further speed up the mission. Basically, CC is a viable option here, but damage is undeniably more effective, making CC the sort of easy way, and damage the fast way. This is similar to the suggestion I made for overhauling Disruption, so I don't really take any issue with this approach. As long as CC isn't actively sabotaging me, I'm perfectly fine with not every game mode being tailored specifically for it. Okay, now we get into the bad stuff. For one, Eximus unit spawns in Holvania are massively increased compared to the rest of the game. As far as I've observed, it seems like they've raised the spawn cap floor from 2 Eximus units to like 5 or 6 in this area specifically, making them a lot more prevalent. This means you're going to be encountering Eximus units a lot more often, which can make them difficult to deal with as you're unable to play into their counters very easily. The Skaldra Dedicant also innately possesses Overguard on top of like a billion effective health, and Tekrot Babau enemies always spawn as Eximus units on top of their billion EHP. Basically, this place has an abnormally high amount of Overguard. Adding onto this is Holvania's season system, where each week the maps change in appearance according with that week's season. These seasons also have an important gameplay impact. Different seasons increase the spawn frequency of different Eximus unit types. Winter brings more Arctic Eximus, spring more Jade Light, summer more Arson, and autumn more Energy Leeches. This further contributes to the problem of making it difficult to play into design counters because things just stack up really fast. You can't exactly roll away from 2 Arson Fire Blasts that are coming from different directions. It's much more difficult to avoid a Jade Light Beam if a new one spawns right after you get rid of the previous one, and Arctic Eximus units stacking their slow auras is just complete cancer. Quick side note, why do these guys even have a slow aura? It's not really telegraphed and is pretty much impossible to avoid, let alone if you have a bunch of them overlapping. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that this has much the same issue as the Steel Path Undercroft spawns. This number of Eximus both makes CC less valuable and also makes playing into counters difficult. The only one I didn't mention being a struggle is the Energy Leech, and that's because I generally find them pretty easy to avoid, though in the underground sections, the tight quarters can make staying off the ground a bit difficult. 1999 also gave us another new game mode, Face Off, which is a series of small objectives that have to be completed in succession in a race against other players. To bolster the PvPvE approach of this game mode, players can pick up buffs for their own team and, more importantly, debuffs for the enemy team. Of these debuffs, there are 2 to note. The first is Eximus Influx, which spawns 5 Eximus units on a random enemy player. This is honestly kind of hilarious, but it can make things difficult to manage when you consider the already increased Eximus spawns. The second one is called Bolstered Bad Guys, which probably sounds pretty familiar. Yep, Bolstered Belligerence is back, granting all enemies Overguard while the debuff is active. Now, granted, these are temporary modifiers in one game mode that are entirely inflicted by other players. It isn't quite as bad as something like Bolstered Belligerence that makes an entire mission essentially no crowd control, but I still feel like it's noteworthy that DE has no problem bringing back these types of mechanics and new content despite how loathed they were in EDA. On the bright side, several of the sub-objectives are fairly CC-friendly, like Lockbox Keys and Balloon Escort. On the not-so-bright side, the mini-boss objective exists, which requires so much DPS that if you were to get it while playing a CC-focused setup, you'd basically be throwing. CC can work for some objectives, sure, but damage works for all of them, so you're best off just going that route. Especially when you consider the already high Overguard amount in Holvania and the aforementioned modifiers, this game mode encourages nuke slop more than anything. Another big thing that happened in 1999 was the Ancient rework, which actually addressed a lot of my ideas about the Ancient healer. They now no longer provide Overguard, instead releasing a pulse every 15 seconds that heals allies in 10 meters for 20% of their maximum health and cleanses status effects. Something kinda funny is that the radiation status doesn't block this, so the newly reworked Nyx can just kinda eat shit against this enemy. But even so, this is a great rework. It makes the Ancient healer an actual healer, and dials back the Overguard spam. Disruptors also lost their Disruption aura, which did actually block certain CC abilities. This is all fantastic, and addressed one of my bigger points about counter mobs in the last video. Oh wait, what's... Oh no. So, the Ancient Healer's Overguard gimmick is now a new enemy called the Protector Ancient. You remember all of the weird quirks and flaws the old healers had that made them strong in theory but not in practice? Well, this enemy does away with those flaws and instead is just... a lot. You'll see what I mean. So, how these guys work is that they periodically release 4 pulses that grant nearby enemies 200% of their maximum health as Overguard per pulse, up to 800% of their health as Overguard. This Overguard decays at a rate of 5% per second, meaning it all goes away after 20 seconds. The interval between pulse releases seems to be about 30 seconds, so there's 20 seconds of Overguard and 10 seconds of no Overguard. Here are where the big differences start to kick in though. Enemies do not lose their Overguard if they walk out of range of the Ancient, or if the Ancient dies, and the Ancient also grants this Overguard regeneration to itself. Not only that, but multiple Protector Ancients can also bolster each other, and while they can't increase the Overguard cap, if they overlap on enemies, they can stack their regeneration, meaning that 10-second or so window of no Overguard can just cease to exist if you have too many Ancients. Oh yeah, these Overguard pulses are also not restricted by line of sight, because I guess only Corvex has to suffer with that kind of thing. Now, fortunately, these Ancients cannot restore Overguard to Eximus units, including themselves if they're an Eximus, which is a minor but noteworthy silver lining. But cool kid, I hear you say. This is an infested enemy. Sure, they're pretty bad, but they only appear in that specific context, right? Well, you see, corrupted Ancients are now also Ancient Protectors, meaning you have to deal with them in Void Fissures. On top of that, because enemies who are corrupted by the Fissure change faction to the Corrupted, this means they can provide their Overguard to nearly every enemy in the entire game, depending on context. One of these guys is bad enough, as they effectively turn off CC for all enemies near them for 20 seconds, but once they start to stack up, they can turn off CC in a much larger area until they're all killed. Because they can regen their own Overguard and each other's Overguard, you don't even have the silver lining of the Ancient itself being easy to kill or crowd control. I could see the idea of maybe flipping Overguard, so that instead of trash mobs being vulnerable and the big guy being immune, now the trash mobs are immune and the big guy is vulnerable. But no, this enemy just makes everyone immune, and it makes playing CC focused frames and Void Fissures awful. I like playing Koumei in Endless Fissure runs. It's really the only place she excels if you ask me, and this enemy has had an immediate and immeasurable negative impact on my experience in that environment. It's so odd to me that they'd rework several CC-focused frames and even add a new one, and then add this enemy that just shuts those abilities off entirely for all enemies near them. I genuinely feel like this enemy is the kind of thing that would be written up as a joke, but was then accidentally actually released into the game. This single enemy is the entire reason I wanted to make this video, because it so perfectly embodies my theory that DE has lost sight of Overguard's original purpose, and instead sees it as a blanket difficulty increase. This thing is basically a portable bolstered belligerence, and because it's in Void Fissures, they are now infesting one of the most important forms of repeatable content the game has to offer. Because you'll be doing fissures often for things like prime parts and ducats, you're going to be seeing a lot of this enemy, especially in endless environments. I know I'm focusing a lot on Void Fissures here, and that's because they're content you'll play at pretty much every stage of your Warframe journey, but I also think it's important to highlight the somewhat obvious fact that the Protector and Corrupted Ancient still exist in Infested and Corrupted missions even outside of Fissures. Between Nullifiers and Ancients, the Corrupted is probably the most anti-CC faction in the entire game at this point. Funnily enough, this also makes the issue of Overguard spam in the Undercroft even worse, as these new Ancients are there on top of the Thrax and the high Eximus spawn count. Like, is it just me here, or does this enemy have nothing to do with Overguard's original intention? They don't force you to contend with special enemy mechanics, they don't make specific targets more of an immediate threat, they just shut off CC in a 10-meter radius for 20 seconds. I don't get it, man, I really don't. I want to make it clear that this enemy's addition does not discredit prior changes that DE has made for making Overguard less oppressive, but this shift with 1999 has led me to develop a new hypothesis, which I'm calling the Overguard Cycle. Let me explain how this has developed and how I expect it to continue. Problem: Eximus units are getting cool new abilities, but players can crowd control them so hard they never see them. Solution: Overguard is introduced to prevent players from shutting down these new enemies right away so that they actually have to contend with their gimmicks. Problem: Overguard has been repeatedly expanded and its rules made more lax, so it's now everywhere, making it much more oppressive. Solution: Introduce new tools to deal with Overguard so as to make it less overwhelming. Problem: New tools made to combat Overguard's prevalence are now too good and too numerous, making Overguard too easy to deal with. Solution: Start spamming Overguard even more to counter the effectiveness of these new tools. As you might notice, it seems like DE is using the tools they gave us to help offset their increase in Overguard spam as a justification to further spam Overguard. Now, you might be wondering, cool kid, what's your source for this? And to that I say, the Unum told me. It came to me in a fate dream.
2 pairs. The crackpot.
Okay, real talk though. Unlike last time, I have no hard data for this. It's entirely a theory based on these trends, but I worry that this is going to continue. Overguard steadily grew in prevalence with things like Duviri, Whispers in the Walls, and Dante Unbound, got dialed back with Jade Shadows and Koumei and the Five Fates, and is now on the uptick again with 1999. This feels like some sort of power creep arms race where the new tools we're given then prompt more of the problem they were meant to solve, which doesn't even address the core issue. Overguard is still in places that violate its original premise, and still removes options from the player with no interesting interaction. Very few of my original criticisms of its prevalence were really addressed at their root. Not only that, but this then makes these new tools feel more and more needed at higher levels of content, which makes the pool of effective tactics there even smaller. When you're drowning in Corrupted Ancients, the only thing you can really do is slap on Magnetic or Secondary Fortifier, and while those are still absolutely great options for dealing with all that Overguard, they also kind of necessarily mean you're foregoing other tactics or playstyles to take them. Not only that, but because these solutions are all damage-based, CC will still not really be needed a lot of the time because you'll just kill the enemy outright. Assassin Posture is kind of the beacon of hope in this regard, as it lets your companion proactively break Overguard for you, though in environments with this much Overguard, it's likely not going to be enough by itself. Okay, so what is the point of all this? Well, 2 things. Firstly, to show how the Overguard situation has evolved in the year or so since the first video. The second reason this video exists, though, is to highlight this emerging trajectory of Overguard spam being back on the upswing. I know the devs only watch my videos when they can remove fun bugs, so they'll never see this, but I do hope this trend doesn't continue. Not only does it feel like it's proving my original point of DE losing sight of what Overguard was originally for, but it's just expanding the problem into more and more of the game. It used to be that this was only really a big issue in a few areas like EDA, but the Protector Ancient makes it a problem everywhere that a Void Fissure is involved, which is really, really bad. I also feel like while the addition of things like Secondary Fortifier and Assassin Posture and Magnetic getting buffed are all great, they don't really address the core problem. Overguard is still being spammed. We're just being given ways to help offset that fact instead of just, not spamming Overguard. Sure, if you're a Secondary Fortifier fan, you probably love stuff like the Protector Ancient because at this point you can never die, but I want to look at the bigger picture here. Excessive Overguard is only getting worse, and while we're being given tools to combat this, they both don't address the root of the issue and then also justify even more Overguard spam. I worry that at some point in the near future there will be content where things like Magnetic and Fortifier will be basically required, and CC will be all but unusable. Time will tell how things shake out, but for now I'm a little bit nervous. Now, before I end this video, I want to clarify why I think this matters. My goal in highlighting my concerns with Overguard is not necessarily to advocate for making the game easier. Warframe is a very easy game, I'm well aware of that fact, and the point of both this video and the last one is not to say that I think Overguard spam makes the game too hard. My issue with Overguard abuse is that it's killing off the crowd control focused playstyle, which is even more bewildering now that they've repeatedly buffed crowd control frames and even given us a new one. So many frames, especially older ones, struggle so much more now that this mechanic is everywhere, and it just makes the game less fun. Like I mentioned earlier, I enjoy doing Endless Fissures with Koumei, so much that she was in my top 5 most played Warframes last year despite coming out in the last 3 months of 2024. The Decree objectives help keep me more engaged than I otherwise would be, and I find it fun. But with these enemies now infesting those game modes, I really don't enjoy it that much anymore, because I feel like my kit just doesn't work half the time, and that sucks. Sure, I can still just kill everything, and that's that, but it doesn't harmonize with how the frame is made, and just isn't fun for me. If you enjoy just dealing a ton of damage or using things like secondary fortifier, that's totally fine, but that doesn't mean this problem doesn't exist. You can play the game however you want, and if you like playing frames like Mesa or Dante, that's great. I just worry that before too long, frames that aren't like them won't see any use in any content that matters. So, that's what's changed and where I think things might be going. I know the title of these videos are somewhat provocative, and I want to clarify again that I don't think I can design this game better than its developers. I just want to share my concerns as a player based on my own experiences playing the game as these things have happened. I also want to say again that the changes that have been made to combat Overguard abuse, like the magnetic overhaul, secondary fortifier, and assassin posture, are all still great changes to the game. I just don't feel like they fix the core issue. We need to just keep in mind what Overguard is for, instead of just adding new ways to deal with it and then spamming it even further. If you've made it this far, do let me know in the comments what you think. Do you agree that Overguard is becoming too prevalent again? Do you think it's been made too easy with all of the new counters we have? Do you think this isn't really a big deal in the first place? Maybe you just use Fortifier and forget Overguard as a mechanic enemies can even have. I'd love to know, just please keep it civil. Beyond that, you can do all the typical nonsense, like, sub, join the Discord, stop by the streams, and so on. I want to give a huge thank you to all of my YouTube members for helping to make this content possible, and I want to thank all of you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time when I struggle to beat the allegations of DE removing things I talk about in my videos.